Thank you, Madam Chairman. My first question is for Ms. Bodine and Mr. Pepper. What is the Brooks Act, and how could it impact small or disadvantaged communities from using these federal funds?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. So the Brooks Act is federal legislation that says if federal dollars are being used for a project, then for the design elements, it has to be a separately competed project, and that the community has to pick from the top three most expert companies. So it's, you know, you could say it's well-intentioned, so you don't go with low-cost bidders on design. You could say, if you wanted to criticize it, you could say it's an example of an association essentially getting into federal law to give them a competitive advantage for federal dollars. But whatever your view is, the reality on the ground is that it does create a tremendous barrier for small communities, because you don't have, you know, these small projects. You don't even have the big national architecture, you know, engineering design firms even bidding on them. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make sense for small projects. I used to get lobbied on this when I worked in the House, and we always raised the small community concern. It did get into the Clean Water Act in 2014 in the WRDA bill, and in my recommendations, I do recommend that Congress amend that to add a cost threshold. Yeah, okay, because I mean, these big engineering firms, they're not going to bid on these small projects. It's not even an issue, but nonetheless, the legislation applies to them.
Mr. Pepper, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Senator. Yeah, you know, in Wyoming, the small communities typically have a consulting engineering firm that they've contracted with that acts in de facto as their engineering department. The engineers then work with Public Works, put a project together, and then it goes out to bid to the contractors who will be performing the actual work. And I think that this particular provision has created an underutilization of the SRF in Wyoming for that reason. USDA and, of course, state money, SLIB, and so forth, don't have that provision, and it allows the communities to utilize that consulting engineer that they've had on staff relatively for a number of years and understands their systems. So I see it as a potential impediment.
Well, thank you. Interestingly, in Wyoming, there are only 12 towns whose population exceeds their elevation. So think about that one. Chew on that for a minute. Ms. Bodine, what are some of the examples of creeping conditions in the March 8th guidance that cause concerns, that jump out at you?
Certainly. Thank you for that question. Well, it is true that when these SRF programs were originally set up, you know, it was a shift from grant programs to state-run programs, and it was initially, you know, very much state-run, and only the initial federal capitalization grants were considered federal dollars. Now, over time, Congress, and this is, you know, Congress has changed the law to apply things like Davis-Bacon and, of course, American Iron and Steel. The infrastructure bill also adds the Buy America, Build America, which we don't have guidance on yet, so it's unclear how that's going to apply. But troublingly, EPA's implementation guidance adds to that. So, you know, it's one thing that Congress put it in, but when EPA is saying things like states should tell their communities that they should enter into project labor agreements, for example, there's nothing in the statute about project labor agreements at all. Yes, Davis-Bacon applies, but not project labor agreements, which says union. And you have right-to-work states. Yeah. So that makes it's not EPA's authority or role to do that. They also, I know that we've heard testimony on both sides on the disadvantaged community definitions and the intended use plans, but again, it's a state decision. I was really happy to hear Senator Carper say, yes, it's very different in Delaware and Wyoming about what's a disadvantaged community. And so this really, truly had to be state decisions. And so my biggest concern was, the EPA didn't say shall, didn't say they must, but says they expect it and that they should do it. And I'm just worried that states will view that as a mandate.
Yeah, well, if it's on a checklist and there's a blank on the checklist, that may trigger EPA to deny some sort of funding. So, yeah, big concern. Thank you. This is for all panelists. What should Congress be doing going forward to make sure these federal dollars make the most impact in the communities that you work or represent? Mayor, would you care to take a stab at that one?
Sure. I think that some of the things, thank you, Senator, I think some of the things that are happening are exactly what needs to happen. The infrastructure bill is important to put resources in the hands of as many people as possible. And if it get directly to the cities, I would advocate that money come directly to the cities. I think cities and mayors can use it very quickly. We can expedite it, and you can see the impact that we have immediately if that in fact takes place. And to make sure that some of this money is actually flexible, that folks can use it in the way that they think is necessary as it relates to the infrastructure in their community, particularly around lead service lines, and it gives us the opportunity to use local laws and state laws as well to do this as quickly as we possibly can.
Mr. Schimmel, any comments on this?
Great. I thank you, Senator. I agree with the mayor. Continued funding is the single most important issue for all of us. I would also add that making sure that there's eligibility for independent utilities such as ours that are regional versus municipal. At points, we have not been eligible for certain funding that has come out because we're a regional entity and don't have a municipal governance. And then continuing to incentivize the state SRF programs to innovate in order to gain new membership into the folks who are utilizing the SRF programs. Not enough folks utilize it, and if there's any way that they can incentivize to lower the bar or make it easier for communities to get their hands on the funding, I think that would be exceptionally important.
Thank you. Ms. Bodine?
Yes, thank you. So this is an historic influx of funding. And so, and yes, it's mostly being channeled through the state revolving loan funds, which are set up as for capital investment. Now, we've heard some of the people here today talk about ability for planning. Yes, it can be used for lead service line inventory, but I guess one suggestion I would make is that that you may want to expand the eligibilities to include some innovative monitoring to identify problems, whether it's the PFAS, whether it's the lead, so that you are providing public health protection right now, because as Senator Booker said when he spoke, it's going to take 10 years or more, for example, to get rid of all the lead service lines. Yeah. And you have people who are exposed in the interim, or we don't know if they're exposed or not. And so taking some small amount of that money, and I'm not, obviously these are hugely expensive programs. You need the capital investment, but taking some money for some interim public health protection might be a good idea.
Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Pepper?
Thank you, Senator. Continued funding, maximum flexibility with the end result in mind, getting from point A to point B, which is upgrading our infrastructure, getting rid of lead lines, addressing PFAS, but allowing maximum flexibility on how we go from point A to point B, I think is probably the determinant that we're going to have going forward.
Thank you. I have the luxury of the fact that the chairman wants to come back from her vote, and so I get to extend the time a little bit, and we'll take advantage of it. So this also is for all the panelists. In the March 8th guidance, Justice 40 is referenced multiple times throughout the document, but the EPA does not define explicitly to state SRF programs, what exactly it is. Justice 40 is the president's plan to have 40% of the benefits from federal investments in climate go to disadvantaged communities. We've heard concerns that Justice 40 is going to lead to a standard one-size-fits-all definition of disadvantaged communities. So to all the panelists, is a disadvantaged community in one state necessarily the same in another? Mayor, would you like to take that one on?
Sure, absolutely. First, I think that it is the right thing to do to identify disadvantaged communities who have not had the ability to respond to environmental issues and other issues that are no fault of their own, except that their zip code. So generally there are things that are similar throughout the country, no matter where you live. People are discriminated against for very specific reasons and are victims of environmental disaster for very specific reasons because they don't have enough money. They're disproportionately black and brown. They may be immigrants and they move into these communities and these things exist there. They're legacy kind of environmental issues that exist in these communities and should be addressed in those communities because they've been there forever. Whether they're next to the water in the port or the airport, all of those things because they're in big cities and rural areas, all of those things need to be addressed. Then there are some specific things that may be particular to other people's communities that are different in other, states and cities. There's some disadvantages that people have, particularly based on the region that they live in. So while those things should be considered, I think is equally important to understand that there's a general sense of what being disadvantaged is, and we cannot have one or the other. We should be dealing with and.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Schimmel, any thoughts to add on that one?
One size does not fit all. Absolutely, we have urban areas, Springfield in particular, disadvantaged community, but I would also look to some of the rural areas in western Massachusetts where it's a two-person shop and they do everything and they don't have the time to fill out the loan paperwork and have never done anything even close to that. And so I think as long as there's not a one-size-fits-all, I think there's a lot of different types of disadvantage, and I think that the funding needs to be able to reach into those corners where it's obvious, but also there's some areas where it's not so obvious, where there's other types of disadvantage. So I think it's important that there's flexibility in all of this, and it's not scripted as a one-size-fits-all.
Thank you. Ms. Bodine, your state and mine have Indian reservations, which would particularly come to the fore when you're thinking about disadvantage in some cases. Certainly that's true in Wyoming on the Wind River Indian Reservation. But would you respond to this question?
And yes, the tribal areas present their own very unique challenges with respect to wastewater and drinking water. And I speak that as the former head of EPA enforcement. It's like, oh no.
Yeah.
But so to your specific question, yes, there was an executive order with a goal of 40% of the funding going to disadvantaged communities. Congress, though, has said, you have said already 49%, not 40%, is to go to disadvantaged communities from these various pots of money. So the issue it's addressed, it's taken care of. There's nothing further, I don't believe, for EPA to do. And so my concern is that there would be an attempt to overlay a federal definition of disadvantaged community on top of what's in the statutes, because the definition both in the infrastructure bill and in the underlying Clean Water Act and in the Safe Drinking Water Act is about eligibility for what's called in the statute additional subsidization. So it's for what are the communities that need this money? They need the extra subsidy. They aren't eligible. They're not eligible for the loans because they'll never be able to pay them back, and therefore the SRFs won't give it to them. And so it's those definitions about where does the money going to go, where it's needed, where are the needs the most, which is specific. Whereas the broader definition of the disadvantaged community, it could be much broader, but it may not bring into account some of the financial affordability issues. So again, You took care of it in the infrastructure bill with the 49% set aside. The underlying statute took care of it by setting up the definitions and the responsibilities for states to set their disadvantaged community criteria. So I don't think there's anything further to be done here to meet, and the goal will be met.
Thank you. And Mr. Pepper?
Agreed. Thank you, Senator. Reservations do pose a great opportunity in Wyoming, as you know. Wind River has 2 tribes. We work very closely with both tribes. In fact, the president of our association is the utility manager for the Eastern Shoshone utility. Yeah, I think it should be left to the states for the definition. I guess taking a wording from a prior career of mine, you say potato, I say potato. I think the definitional aspects should be left to the states.
Well, thank you all very much. I will return the gavel to our committee chairwoman, Senator Duckworth.